Hi there. Welcome to Remarkable Top 5. Join me as we explore the world's most fascinating and amazing top 5 lists. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Let's get started.
Before we begin, we at Remarkable Top 5 want to take a moment to offer our deepest condolences to the families and loved ones of the victims of these heinous crimes. We recognize that discussing the actions of these individuals can be difficult and upsetting, and we approach this topic with the utmost respect and sensitivity. Our goal is to raise awareness about the dangers posed by serial killers and to honor the memory of their victims. Today we are counting down the top deadliest serial killers of all time. Starting at number 5 is Gary Ridgway. Also known as the Green River Killer, was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. He operated in the Seattle-Tacoma area of Washington state during the 1980s and 1990s, and he was responsible for the deaths of at least 49 young women. Ridgway's victims were often prostitutes or runaways, and he would lure them into his truck with the promise of money or drugs. He would then take them to a secluded area, strangle them, and dump their bodies in the nearby Green River. The investigation into the Green River Killer was one of the largest and most complex in American history. Police spent years searching for evidence and interviewing witnesses, but Ridgway managed to evade capture for nearly 2 decades. Ridgway was finally arrested in 2001 after DNA evidence linked him to the murders. He ultimately confessed to killing 71 women, although he was only convicted of 49. During his trial, Ridgway showed no remorse for his crimes, and he often boasted about his ability to manipulate and control his victims. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he is currently serving his sentence at the Washington State Penitentiary. The legacy of the Green River Killer is one of tragedy and horror. The lives of 49 young women were cut short by the senseless and evil acts of one man. May we never forget the victims of this heinous killer, and may justice always be served. At number 4 we have Pedro Lopez. Also known as the Monster of the Andes, Pedro Lopez was known to stalk in several South American countries during the 1970s and 1980s, and he was responsible for the deaths of at least 110 young girls. Lopez's victims were often impoverished and vulnerable, and he would lure them away from their families with promises of food or shelter. He would then rape and strangle them, leaving their bodies in remote locations. He was finally arrested in 1980 after attempting to abduct a young girl in Ecuador. When police searched his home, they found a collection of over 50 videotapes documenting his murders. During his trial, Lopez confessed to killing over 300 girls, although he was only convicted of 110. He claimed that he had been driven to commit these heinous acts by a voice in his head that commanded him to kill. Lopez was initially sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison due to a technicality. He was eventually released from prison in 1998 and deported to Colombia, where he disappeared into obscurity. The legacy of Pedro Lopez is one of horror and tragedy. The lives of over 100 young girls were cut short by the senseless and evil acts of one man. May we never forget the victims of this heinous killer, and may justice always be served. Continuing at number 3 is Luis Garavito, also known as the Beast, was one of the most depraved and sadistic serial killers in history. He committed his crimes in Colombia during the 1990s and was responsible for the deaths of at least 138 young boys. Garavito's victims were often poor and vulnerable, and he would lure them away from their families with promises of food or money. He would then torture, rape, and murder them, often cutting off their genitals and leaving their bodies in remote locations. Garavito was finally arrested in 1999 after being caught in the act of attempting to abduct a young boy. When police searched his home, they found a collection of items belonging to his victims, including toys, shoes, and clothing. During his trial, Garavito confessed to killing over 300 young boys, although he was only convicted of 138. He also claimed that he had been driven to commit these heinous acts by a voice in his head that commanded him to kill. Garavito was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison, which is the longest sentence in Colombian history. He is currently serving his sentence at the Villavicencio prison. Luis Garavito's legacy is one of horror and depravity. The lives of over 100 young boys were cut short by the senseless and evil acts of one man. May we never forget the victims of this heinous killer, and may justice always be served. At number 2 is Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death, was a British physician who was responsible for the deaths of at least 218 of his patients. He operated in the town of Hyde, in Greater Manchester, during the 1980s and 1990s. Shipman's victims were often elderly women, and he would inject them with lethal doses of diamorphine, a powerful painkiller. He would then forge medical records to cover up his crimes and make it appear as though the deaths were natural. Shipman was finally arrested in 1998 after a colleague became suspicious of the high death rate among his patients. When police searched his home, they found evidence linking him to the deaths of several patients. During his trial, Shipman was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 2004. One of his victims' family members stated, "He was a monster in a white coat. He took away my mother's life and he destroyed our family." The legacy of Harold Shipman is one of betrayal and horror. The lives of over 200 patients were cut short by the senseless and evil acts of one man. May we never forget the victims of this heinous killer, and may justice always be served. And finally, at number 1 we have Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who was one of the most feared and notorious serial killers in history. She was born in Hungary in the late 16th century, and over the course of several years, she committed some of the most heinous and gruesome acts imaginable. Bathory was obsessed with youth and beauty, and she believed that bathing in the blood of virgins would keep her young and beautiful forever. She would lure young girls to her castle under the guise of offering them work or education, and then she would imprison them and subject them to unspeakable acts of violence. Bathory would torture her victims, often cutting them with knives or burning them with hot irons. She would also bite chunks of flesh from their bodies and force them to eat their own flesh. And when she was finished, she would drain their blood and bathe in it. It is believed that Bathory may have killed as many as 650 young girls before she was finally caught and arrested in 1610. She was put on trial, along with several of her accomplices, and was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and torture. Bathory was sentenced to life in solitary confinement, but her accomplices were not so lucky. They were tortured and executed in gruesome ways, including being burned alive and having their fingers torn off one by one. Bathory spent the rest of her life in a small cell in her castle, where she eventually died in 1614. But her legacy lives on as one of the most terrifying and gruesome serial killers in history. Thank you for watching this episode of Remarkable Top 5. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to be notified when we release new videos. Before we go, let's take a moment to honor the victims of these horrific crimes. It is important to remember that behind each number is a human life that was taken too soon.